Okay, hello everybody. My name is Puck Curtis, and I am here with my co-host Eric Myers, and we are representing the Sacramento Sword School. Our guest speaker tonight is Dario Sanchez Garcia, and he was born in Ávila, Spain in 1991. He didn't train much in his childhood in the martial arts, but he practiced karate for a couple of years. In the mid-2000s, he moved to Salamanca to study mathematics, and he became interested in both reenactment and historical fencing. But it wasn't until 2011 when he started practicing HEMA. When he started, he was influenced by both AGEA and AEEA. Those are two of the different groups in Spain. And some of the initial study group members were members. Through the group, or though the group had influences, there was not an actual instructor, and thus he began to study both Verdadera Destreza and I-33 by himself. In 2015, they founded a HEMA salle in Ávila, and he was assigned the role of 133 instructor. In 2016, he moved to Madrid and joined ASESTA, one of the salles there that are part of AEHCA, and around the same time he started teaching Verdadera Destreza in AJHCA, AEHCA. Until 2018, he studied with Héctor Hernández, and during that time he joined different cultural activities done by ASESTA. In 2018, he started working as a mathematics high school teacher and moved back to Ávila, where he could put more effort into teaching both Verdadera Destreza and 133. In 2019, AEHCA joined Academia da Espada under maestro Ton Puey, though he had directly influences Dario's practices since 2014. And he's part of a team of instructors now. They've been collaborating with Avila's military archive and AJHIS and Salamanca's University. We're also really pleased to have him because Ton actually contacted me and said, this is a person that you really should have speak because he can talk very well about mathematics and destreza. So we're very pleased to have you. I hope you feel welcome, and we're looking forward to everything that you have to say.
I'm really welcome, and I'm really glad that you let me join in. First of all, sorry if I make any mistake regarding language, because I'm a bit rusty in my speaking abilities. And if you feel that any term or anything that is in the presentation is a little odd or it's wrongly written or anything, jump in and tell me and I think.
So we're having some trouble hearing you right now. The volume's low again.
Sorry, bit up. Yes, it's better now.
Yes, I think it might have to do with moving the mic closer to your mouth.
Yeah, probably. So I'll try to keep it the closer possible to my mouth.
That's good, thanks.
Okay, so if you thank you for letting me join in, and if you think I'm going to share the presentation.
We can see your screen.
Okay, you can see now in full screen?
Yes.
Okay. So I'm going to talk to you about mathematics and fencing, and in particular about Verdadera Destreza, but I like to start with a little martial and mathematical context, because usually, at least here in Spain, we tend to think about Verdadera Destreza being like this one star alone in the sky, being all brilliant and all, because it involves mathematics. And I think that it's just other step in the way of fencing through the Middle Ages and Renaissance. So I think a little bit of previous context is better, and probably you all know about it and are probably more proficient than I am in this, but still think it's worth taking a look at it. And mainly I want to talk about some characteristics of fencing that I think are important to look Verdadera Destreza for before deepening. The first of all is that, as we know, is focusing self-defense. The sword is used in both symmetric and asymmetric situation. What I mean by this is, and I've tried to show it here with these little guys over here, both for the Battaglia, 1323 and Artelletica, is that we see the sword used both against sword with different combinations, such as sword and buckler, and against sword and buckler, but we also see, like in Artelletica and other treatises, like Fior de Battaglia, where I think we can find a spear against sword or dagger against sword. We can find sword with cloak against sword with dagger, or sword with sword alone against sword and dagger. And I think this is interesting because the Destreza is mainly focused in symmetric situations, so it makes it easier to mathematize and parameterize some of the characteristics of fencing. And I think that a lot of later treatises focus on the symmetric situations because it's easier and it's less sloppy to explain and go through the techniques. And I think that's quite important because when we think about applying mathematics to things, we think as if it's some kind of magic tool that fixes everything and puts everything in its place, and actually it's quite hard to do that. So it's a central treatise element, as you know, and appears through a wide span of time with a lot of cross-reference between treatises, which is also important because even in Destreza we have references to other treatises. Usually Pacheco talks about other people to fund them or to say that they are bad fencers or whatever, but Carranza, for instance, I think he talks about Agrippa with some kind of regard, and he is influenced by him. The treatises are made in power or cultural centers of influence, so this I like to talk about this a little bit because I think it's important to understand that science is also made in these same centers of power. To develop mathematics and to develop other science, you need to be able to be in a quiet position, to say. You cannot be worrying about your crops and going to work every day. You need certain calm, certain cultural references, as you were talking before of Aristotle and so on. If you don't have that, you probably are going to miss some things, or you are not getting the ideas to go forward in your science or in your study of different things. And fencing is no different from any other areas of human knowledge. So it's important to think about it because if the connection between mathematics and fencing, it's not. It wasn't to happen if fencing was about going into the streets and kill each other with swords, because they weren't be thinking, oh, okay, so I can apply some geometric stuff here while I kill you with my dagger in some pub. About the mathematical context, I'm going to span through it really fast because it's most history of mathematics, 15th and 17th and 16th century, and also in the 17th century. There was a great development. New areas of mathematics were born or put there almost to get birth, like the differentiation and integration calculus and integration. And it was really impressive. It's almost like all the work done in the Middle Ages were focusing in that point just to grow really, really fast through the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, especially the 17th one and then it goes all crazy from there to the 18th and 19th century. So as some highlights, we have Napier Napier impulse science with logarithms. We also have Descartes founding analytic geometry. We have Mersenne giving his algorithm for prime numbers, was used through the next 200 years until it was proven to be false. And then we talk about Mersenne prime numbers instead of prime numbers alone from the algorithm, because it didn't cover all the prime numbers. It would have been wonderful if it does. Wallace studied the conics as ratio curves, which might not seem to be like a really important thing, but it's like with Descartes Wallace was applying Descartes analytic geometry to the conics, and he was also applying polynomials to study geometry, which shows us that they were mixing areas that until that point were not meant to be mixed, and that is quite important because we see that also in the 20th century, and it's like the gateway to further development in mathematics. Pascal wrote the first combinatory treatise, and Newton and Leibniz founded infinitesimal calculus with all his bitterness and disagreements. And the Bernoulli brothers placed the basis for differential calculus. All this happened through the 17th century, though without the work of the two previous centuries, it wouldn't have been possible. And it's, as I said, it's no wonder that being fencing and mathematics is something that requires that same cultural environment to develop. Not the same, of course, but they were at the same time developing and taking new ways to think of it. I think it's no wonder they at some point get mixed. And we can see it because we have some precursors and contemporary people that did it, not only in Destreza, but also in other countries and in other styles. I think the first treaty where we can find geometry is in Opera Nova. I'm talking about explicit geometry or explicit mathematics because I think David Rowling has a video talking about
17th century.
I think David Rowling has some video talking about geometry in 133, but it's implicit. It's not explicit. It's not explicit thing. We can divide it, and we might talk later about this, but it's not out there to be seen and appreciate easily. You have to study the treaty, understanding it, and then thinking, okay, they might be dividing the space into the guards and so on. So the first one that has something quite explicit is the Opera Nova, which is not very, very explicit, but in the floor tiles we see measurements, we can see angles, and it's some way to begin to put mathematics in fencing, because all the previous treatises don't talk about distance, which is something basic in geometry, and therefore starting to put on it in the treatises, even if it's using the floor tiles to be able to measure, or the angles of the diagram, the circle diagram that Marozzo uses. I think it's quite important to acknowledge that. Then we have Camilo Agrippa, who I'm not going to pronounce the name of the treatise, because if I might be struggling to speak in English, it's adding Italian to the equation is not going to end well. So he uses angles and triangles to explain different defenses and attacks. I haven't studied I think I've said Opera Nova was the first. No, Camilo Agrippa was the first. I don't know why I have them the other way around. But Camilo Agrippa, I take a look at of it. I have talked with some people that have read it more in depth than I am, and he basically uses the angles and triangles to explain the arms and the weapons position while you are defending and attacking. So it's quite interesting because I don't know if he uses the mathematical properties. I don't know if he uses mathematical properties, but I'm quite sure he's using some of them to explain at least the coverings of the defenses. Then we have Joachim Meyer, which its treatise had a lot of explicit geometry, both on the floor tiles and in the body division. That is not equal to Verdadera Destreza division of the body, but it follows quite a similar way, using straight lines and trying to place them in important places of the body to show where we have to land the attacks and place the sword. And finally, which actually was quite a surprise for me because I didn't know it until Manuel Valle and Ton Puey told me. They were like, you have to look at this. And I was really surprised because we have in Federico Gislero, we have explicit circles, angles, straight lines, and we have even one or two pictures where he shows an almost similar, equivalent to the common circle of the Verdadera Destreza. Well, I don't know if you are used to translate the Destreza terms like círculo común or use common circle and proportionate mean and so on.
We know that one, yeah.
I think I've translated most of them. If I've done poorly, or you use other term, or you prefer the Spanish terms, just let me know. I shall continue. Okay, so I'm going to divide to take a look to the mathematics in the stress. I'm going to divide the treatise into three categories actually. The first one are the two first, which are Carranza's and Pacheco first book. Then I'm going to take a look into other three treatises, and then we are going to take a last look to which could be the beginning of the Destreza, the route into the Spanish society with the other books of Pacheco, Carranza, Ettenhar's one, the other Viedma, and the twilight of it with Rada as the last great treatise. So in 1569 we have Filosofía de las Armas, in where Carranza starts a mathematical approach to the combat system, and following it we have Pacheco de Narváez in 1605 with Grandezas de la Espada, which makes Carranza's system to root and then develops his own way. Pacheco, he tells quite freely that he's happy with Carranza at first, though later he will move into other positions and even criticize some of the Carranza's statements. So this is a free translation / interpretation, close interpretation about one paragraph of Carranza's third dialogue, and I'm going to read it for you, if you let me. The study mathematics perform upon reality in their pursuit of reaching the clearest simplicity and obtaining universally true solutions in order to apply them to complex problems allows us to equip ourselves with the necessary tools to study fencing. It's not like this simple in the treatise. It's a bit longer and a bit also weirder in the way it talks about mathematics. But it's a pretty clear statement about, from Carranza, who is trying to say that he's going to use mathematics to parameterize fencing, and he thinks it's the best tool. We also have an interesting peek about how society saw mathematics then, because he talks about music, arithmetic, geometry, and it's quite interesting. I'm not going too deep in. Yeah, I was reading the comment. Well, it's not so small, but the techniques part it's smaller than the other ones. And I was oh yeah, Carranza explained us about how what are the branches of mathematics, and he explains why every branch has some usefulness to Destreza. He sets some basis for the study of fencing regarding mathematics. Some of them are quite strange and cryptographic, like like his common circle or his inferior plane. As you can see in the lower picture. Others are quite more useful and clear, like the division of the sword. And I'm going to enumerate the ways he employs mathematical concepts into fence. He uses angles to position both arm and sword. He starts graduating the arm and the sword. He uses division of movements in combinable directions, which is an expression that I'm not sure I've written down well, but I mean that he tries to, it's almost like a vector space where he is talking about different directions and different ways of movement that he then mixes up, like Pacheco will do, and Viedma, and almost everyone. But in Destreza, he's the first that do it, because there are certain things that we are taking for granted in Carranza, because we think, okay, if it's in Pacheco, if it's in Edenhard, it should be in Carranza, but there are other additions that people do through the Destreza history. He uses circles and its division to describe different positions, as I told, sometimes quite cryptographically with this picture. And he starts the classification of wounds by their path, meaning that thrusts are straight lines and slashes are curved lines, which then they use to bound it to the property of straight and curved lines and say, okay, straight line is faster, curved line is slower because it covers smaller space, so it has to be slower. Which is interesting because one thing that they try to do all along Destreza is try to bound not physical properties always, but fencing properties to mathematical properties, meaning that as they bound them, they can use what they think it's the mathematical core of the properties of their techniques to say, okay, this is better, this is worse, this is faster, this is slower, or this puts you into a more dangerous position than this other one, like the thrust and the cuts from Rada's means of proportionate means. Let's talk about Nico and what he adds to Carranza, because in his first treaty, he completely says that he's a disciple of Carranza. He's studying and explaining Carranza's work, but he adds some little things that are related to geometry, to the ways of explaining Carranza's work, which could be interesting to check if all they match with what Carranza said. The first thing we have said, as you can see in the middle picture, is that we have a common circles full diagram, which is understandable and which more or less is the common circle that we are going to see in almost every Destreza treaty from here on. We are going to see additions to this diagram, like Ettenhard will do, I think he adds something also to it, and of course Rada, but in the core it's almost the same. He uses distance and positions using, well, he describes distance and positions using the arc of central angles of circumferences. And which, what I mean by that, it's if we take, I've checked it, if we take the curved steps that he described, and you have an example here in the first picture, in the above picture. All the curved lines are made by circles, by parts of circles measured by the arc over by a central angle. Which at first, when I take a look, I thought, okay, this seems quite natural, but we don't know because there are a lot of ways to draw a curved line, and some of them were clearly, because they were almost full circle, they were clearly done that way, but a lot of other ones I wasn't so sure, so I checked it, and almost all of them. There are some mistakes that we could talk about. Printing mistakes, drawing mistakes, or whatever, but I think up to the 80% of the steps in Pacheco are all done this way. Which, well, it will perfectly mean that he was obsessed with circles, or that he wants to tell us something about by using those circles and the radii he uses in every one of them. He starts to talk clearly about the mean of proportion by checking the ratio between segments, or by swords, obviously. But well, if we take out the swords, they are just segments that he is measuring by the ratio and saying, okay, this is your proportion, your mean of proportion. If you are, if you have the same sword, if you have a shorter sword, or if you have a longer sword, which is just doing that, taking a ratio and saying, okay, you do this and do that. He used circumferences and their divisions to explain the relation between fighters, which is basically he has some sections talking about movement and how you move through the common circle, and if your opponent do this, you shall move this way, and he is using always symmetry and opposing points in circumferences. The footwork, I have already, well, I explained a little bit of this, but not everything. If you check the above and the below pictures, you can see that in the above picture is very nicely done. They have the measure of the footwork, and then he completely forgets about it and says, okay, I have told you how you have to move, the measurements, everything. I'm not going to use it to almost 100 examples of footwork. And, well, it's not very consistent. Let's say that he's not very careful with their measures, with his measures. Movement of arms, arm bars, I mean the joints, like wrist, elbow, and shoulder. They are described with concentric circumferences, which is not very physical accurate, but it's quite nice to explain the angular velocity and the momentum the sword takes when we are performing slashes from the shoulder, elbow, or wrist, as they are faster as we use slower circumferences, but they are also weaker. So we do it from the wrist, we have a slower, we have a faster movement, but weaker in the perform of the slash, and it's shown in the treatise by a smaller circle. And finally, we have pseudo coordinates, which are distant from diameter and footwork length. And I'm talking about pseudo coordinates because he is not very clear in the way we should use them. It's not very clear if he knows what coordinates are. Probably he won't. He wouldn't be. But it's there. It's just telling us where to put ourselves with a reasoning system.
I have a question.
Yeah, sure. Tell me.
So one of the things we see in Pacheco is he has some very precise notation on the distance of his steps. Yeah. And later we see Ettenhard toss all that out and say, look, it isn't really useful to measure the steps so precisely because you need to change for the context. So do you have any insight on what Pacheco's doing? Have you tried these steps specifically to see, because some of them are quite long when we tried them. What is your take on that?
Yes. Well, Pacheco is quite tricky on that. At first, I thought he would use the description used about pasada, geometric, compás geométrico, compás simple. But as you say, some of them are quite long. If they are done with some motion, like you were dancing, they are easier to do. But sometimes Pacheco says you are standing in right angle, blah blah blah, and then you took a 6-foot step or a 5-foot. I think he talks about compás geométrico being the longest step you can perform, and it's 5 steps. 5 foot wide. I don't know if he uses a 6-foot step anytime, but I'm saying also this, but I will say that he's not consistent in his own work. If we take a look to the measures he uses when he is describing the actions in the diagrams, we can see the two swords like in a projection into the floor, and he draws the lines. There we can see that he is not using 1 foot, 2 foot, 3 foot, 5 foot steps. He is just using the distance, as Ettenhard says later. If he needs a 3.5 foot step, he'll do it. He draw that way in the treatise, so he's kind of misleading, because at first he's like very rigid about it, like say, no, you have to do this type of footwork and there is no other way. And then he did as he didn't do it very often, but he did something that Pacheco is quite fond of doing, which is contradicting himself. So actually, I think that Pacheco, he does not so long steps sometimes, but it's hard to know exactly what he's telling us, because a lot of time he's not doing it precisely. I mean, he's telling us to move from one point to another point, but sometimes the notation is wrong. In the first pages, for instance, in the first pages of the treatise, he's talking about moving around the common circle, and he gives a 5-foot measure, and he's talking about going through one point to another, which are correspondent to the vertex of a square inscribed in the common circle. But the notation says you are going through the diameter. and then the notation says you are going through one vertex to another in a 45-degree angle, which is more interesting and more consistent with the 5-foot step that he asks you to do. Because if we all think about a 5-foot diameter, we are almost hitting each other's already with our swords. So he's quite sloppy in some things, and I wouldn't take the measurement of the footwork, at least the first measurements of the footwork, as some rigid rules, because he's not doing so. Later, he's not doing so. I have said previously that I checked if the steps were all part of a circle. And I also, while I was doing that, I also checked the distance they covered, and they are not consistent. You can, they have some consistencies and some interesting properties, like a lot of them uses the same radius, and I think it's the common circle radius, but the distance they cover is like, sometimes it's very precise, sometimes you miss, he asks you to thrust and you might end like almost a foot away from your opponent, so he's asking you to do extremo de cuerpo. I'm not really, I think it's showing that I don't have a very good statement to say about Pacheco, because I think it's quite hard to make a statement, because he's very rigid at first, then he's sloppy. Oh yeah. Thank you for clarifying that, Pac. I don't know, I think Pacheco is, it's very rigid at first, like you have to learn this, you have to master it, and then you can do whatever you want. But first you have to master it. It's like, I don't know, it's like a weird way to do it, because in the study of the footwork that I have done, I have tried them, and well, of course you can do it. Almost all the steps, sometimes they are hard to do, but I don't know if while we are fighting, they are very useful as a rigid tool. I think he meant to have some teaching tools, like the very rigid ones. Then he will do like Ettenhart says, like some more freely movement.
Thanks. That answers my question.
I hope I have answered it rightly, because I've kind of been a little bit fussy about my opinion there, because it's not so very based. Okay, now I'm going to take over to the next 4 treatises. I have been having this doubt that I am going to ask you now. It's treatise or treatises?
I think the plural is treatises.
Treatises. Okay, because I started putting treatises, then I wrote treatise, and I checked in Google, and he didn't answer me. I wasn't very happy with Google. Okay, so we are taking a look now to Dia de Viedma, Pacheco de Narváez again in 72, which was written before, but published in 60-72. To Ettenhart in 75, and finally to Laurent de Rada. They are settling the system, they are making it root in the society, and Rada is, I don't know if he's rooting it into, or he's just closing it and saying it dies slowly. Okay, we all know Destreza goes on for another century or even 2 centuries, but it's not the same. Okay, in Dia de Viedma, very much editions, which is common in other authors like Gala. But we have something interesting because he tells us that he's a Pacheco principal, that he has changed some letters with Pacheco, that they are same way, they have the same way of seeing. But then he explains almost all the techniques from Pacheco's first treatise. And, well, he declares an orthos, as saying, and then he redams the Pacheco's footwork and techniques by doing something quite interesting, that is, he inscribed regular polygons in the circumference. He didn't draw the octagon he uses to describe the circumference, but he actually don't give us, well, he doesn't give us the measurement for the diameter or the radius of the common circle. Instead, he gives the side of the regular octagon inscribed in it, which it's quite close to the 4 feet that, sorry, to the 4 foot that Rada will use later on. And if we measure it and do the simple math that it's behind measuring the radius, which we can see that it's almost 4 foot for every author. But he uses that. He uses a polygon, an octagon actually, and then he uses it not also to describe the common circle, but he uses also the lines that form star-like polygons inside that octagon to talk about the movement outside of the circle, the common circle. So Dia de Biesma talks a lot about going from A to B, being A to B the ones that are on the same side of the circle, and then talks a lot about going from B to C, changing sides, which means that he's going to the left C instead of the right C that we can see in the picture. And it's quite interesting because when I figured it, I instantly thought about the bolt, which I haven't studied, but I know the really amazing looking pictures and so, and I think he uses more polygons than circles. And it was interesting that Dia de Bielma does something similar, because also it quite matches Pacheco's footwork. Not the original one, but the one that we can infer from studying the diagrams, which again, I don't know if it's actually what Pacheco intended to do, or it's just a representation, or what I've said. I'm quite, I don't like to say a big statement about Pacheco because it's kind of difficult to not find yourself contradicting the author or the author contradicting you in the next trick. But it quite matches. It's very similar. Then we have. Oops. I'm having this pop-up with the. Then we have Pacheco's final analysis, paciencia, and we have the lugar de la demostración, which is the perfect picture to have in every picture of the treaty. He's talking a lot about geometry, and he's not showing us any draw. He refers to point A, point B, point C, point D, blah, 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 and always lugar de la demostración, which is quite sad. But we can check some geometry and mathematics around. He to differentiate the straight footwork between the angle it makes with the diameter. At first, Pacheco talks about straight footwork being that one that it's a straight line, meaning that he doesn't differentiate between traverse step and recto step. And here in Nueva Ciencia, he starts to differentiate in that. So he divides the straight lines into two. The ones that make an angle with the diameter and the ones that are following the diameter, which is quite interesting because it shows that even Pacheco had a living destreza there and not a rigid, very rigid system that he was like, no, this is destreza. Okay, he does that, but he's telling it about his own work, but he's also updating his own work. We have a more detailed geometric body division because in the first treaty, I think he talks about very little of the division, like the verticales, colaterales, and diametral, and that's that. And here he talks a little bit more about it. He uses triangles. He uses triangles for analyzing stances, though he didn't quite get into it. I mean, he says, okay, we are making triangles. This is a very good position. This is really hard position, a really strong one. But he didn't analyze if they are equilateral, they are isosceles. He just says, okay, there are triangles. Where? Everywhere. But I think he's trying to. Use some of the Carranza's and Agrippa's previous work, but he's not really into it, so he didn't pay a lot of attention to it. He described the proportionate mean as a finite set of positions, which is interesting because we will have Rada doing another thing later on. And this finite set of positions is one position for every technique, let's say. I'm talking about tretas as techniques because I think treat is not like, quite good in English to talk about treta. So I don't know if you prefer treta or technique. If you prefer any one of them.
I'm comfortable with both.
Okay. So for techniques that are wounding, he gives a finite set of. He depends and details the use of angle to analyze sword binds, because at first he talks about swords making angles, which is quite obvious. They are straight lines or segments, and of course, if they cut each other, they make some angles. But in this treatise, he makes an interesting analysis. So if we want to say about how wide is the angle, well, he talks about how to use these angles, talking about the width of the angle, to use it for putting there the body or not putting it, or using it for tajo, or performing other treaties. He used sets of action and its relations to classify the techniques or tretas. Here, yes, it's for classifying all the techniques, but also the tretas, which is quite interesting because and this is something that I got wrong at first, then I corrected myself, I was corrected, then I was wrong again. It's weird because he starts talking about the three dignidades, the three dignities of the techniques, and he starts talking about very simple ones, then the generales, and then the third dignity, which he says, well, they are the ones that are made from the atajo, and I quite like that because it's very, how to put it down? It's very mathematical, but it's also a pain in the ass. Because we could say that, okay, third dignity is the atajo, the right angle, and the movement of conclusion, and we'll be like, okay, it's fine. But then we have to think, okay, this is not exactly what he's talking about. He's talking about the ones that are made from the atajo, meaning that you have to perform an atajo and then do a cut, a thrust, a linear cruise, whatever. So he's using a relation between techniques to explain what techniques are there. Because if he had to say, okay, all these techniques are here, he would be like Rada. He would be like Rada, telling us, okay, proposition 1, proposition 2, this long list of techniques is the third dignity, or this short list of techniques is the third dignity. But he's using that relation to avoid doing that. I think it's a way to describe something that should be. I'd like it to be a more detailed thing in his treaty, and not okay. All these ones, just figure out what they are. Well, what I've said, this is the closest to an image in the treatise, which is 821 pages long. I think it's fine. And Rada justifies him, saying it's other guy's fault, which it's quite certain, as he died, he passed on the treaty without the pictures, he asked the people to edit it, to check if there was any errata, and they didn't put the pictures on, they didn't check for any errata, and they just published it like 30 years after Pacheco's death. Okay, so before we go into Rada's last Destreza, we have to take a look to Etenhardt's, which is a summary of Pacheco's work, but have some novelties which are interesting, and which are mainly the two ones that are here in the pictures. He starts the parameterization of the space employing revolution surfaces, putting vertex and axis into the arms and joints. And this is quite interesting because Pacheco didn't do it. Carranza's either Via de Viedma, no clue if he knew about it. But Etenhardt starts talking about cones, spheres, and it's a really nice way to show us where to move our sword and where it has to be. It's almost like a coordinate system, but it's overkilling it. There are positions that require less objects to define them, but it's quite nice and it seems to fit quite naturally to the body movement. He also employs parallel perspective to describe the actions, which gives us furthermore than beautiful images for the first time in the Destreza treatise. Hooray! We also got nice description, a nice image about what we might have seen in a Destreza fight or in a Destreza training, which we didn't have with Pacheco or Dia de Viedma or anyone else before, because we have this projection of the swords into the floor, which is nice to have some details about the techniques employed and described, but it's lacking a lot of description properties that we would like how close the point has to be to the face, how up the arms should be, how low. Etenhardt gives us that, though he, instead of doing like Rada will do later, he just takes the parallel perspective and eliminates from the floor projection of the swords. He also shows the body division Pacheco's described. Sorry, errata. Division. It's big division. The Spanish word for it. And it's quite nice also to
You can to be able to check if we are thinking right about collateral, diametral, and verticalis. And this is almost all the novelties that Ettenhard introduces in his treatise. And finally, I put the interrogation sign there because I don't. Okay, the Destreza goes on, but we don't have any big treaty after Rada. Rada is quite. I don't know if I'd say the peak. Probably it's the peak of the Destreza, at least in the theoretical way, because it's the most complete author. I think it's the most complete author. Okay, this is an opinion, not a statement. But there is more Destreza about after Rada, and I think say that he closes the Destreza, it's not quite accurate. So I think he tries to close the study, but he manages sometimes to close some lines of the fencing study, like, okay, this is the best way to do it, not to do it, to explain it and to study it, but sometimes he doesn't. So he's trying it really hard, but in some ways he performs really well, in others, well, not so well. Something that I don't like about Rada is that he's talking about everybody else. He takes peaks and takes things from almost every Destreza author, but he's not in a knowledge in Pacheco's work. It's quite. This is not the right way. One thing that is very characteristic about Rada is that he formalizes everything with mathematical properties using modern mathematical proofs. What I mean about modern mathematical proofs, almost every author uses pictures to say, images to say this is the proof that the right angle is the best angle to reach out. It's the one that reaches out the most for angles. Rather do it in the way that a mathematician or an engineer will do. He says, okay, if I take this point and I check the measures, these are the properties of this point, I'll show that every other point is closest to the body. And then he says, okay, if I open the angle and maintain the distance, then the point I'm describing is a circumference, is making a circumference. Then if I take any point of the circumference that is out of the diameter, blah, 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 blah. I don't know if I'm explaining myself, but what I meant is that he's more close to what we would thought about mathematics now than that Carranza or Pacheco were. And we can check it because he also proposes some mathematical exercises that any diestro should know before fencing, which is quite horrendous because they are not very difficult, but they are difficult enough to say, okay, this might not be necessary for fencing. So he's really into mathematical proofs, and he really shows that he knows mathematics. I know my shit, man. And he states this really, really hard into the treatise. He uses locus versus finite sets. I think locus is right for the geometric place, like a circumference, ellipses, and so on. Because as it's translating from Spanish to English mathematics, I wasn't sure. He exposes locus versus finite set. What does this mean for me? This means that Pacheco is telling us that, okay, there are X positions to wound the enemy. These are for, I'd say like this one. These are the positions to wound from a thrust. These are the positions to wound from cut. And they are very, very rigid. It gives us a distance from one position, from our initial position,
and to the diameter most of the time. But Rada then says, no, you can wound from any position that it's at 6 foot from the enemy. And this is a circumference and all the work about the orbes that Rada does. That's locus. It's more closer. Well, it's closer to Descartes than Pacheco. It's trying to do more analytic work about fencing than. Okay, let's be fair with Pacheco. He was writing before Descartes did, so it's normal that he didn't take some of the ideas. But the way of taking the look about how to describe the space from both of them, it's quite different. And the main difference, I think, it's that Rada takes that jump from the finite set of points to the locus, to an infinite set of points that are bound to a rule. Okay, there. He uses rule and compass in the lower plane, meaning that all the constructions that we can check in Rada are done like the Greeks would have done it, using just compass and rule. This is a way to work. You can measure. You can take a measure from there to from here to there. You can use circles. You can draw points. But you can do certain things like, okay, I'm going to calculate outside the paper the square root of this. No, you have to draw a square, draw a square that has the diagonal with the correct length given the Pythagoras theorem and so on. Which is quite nice for drawing, but it's quite a pain for working. He describes the proportional mean, and I kind of like to talk about as the hidden mean, because we can find it in Pacheco's per treatise. We can find the proportional mean. We can find it in Díaz de Viedma, but it's not described. They don't say, okay, this is it. This is the proportional mean, but they are walking through it. They are using it to describe fencing quite precisely and quite similarly to Rada. And Rada goes and says, okay, I'm going to bound this to mathematical property that is the proportionate mean, the proportional mean. And I'm going to name it, and I'm going the one to discover it. But if we check, if you let me go back to Díaz de Viedma, if we check the point B, you can see my mouse? Okay. If we check this point B, it's almost in the same place that Rada described the proportional mean. We go to Rada. I think this is the proportional mean. Yep. This. If we do the math, it's almost in the same place. It's almost Rada is a little bit off from the octagon vertex, but it's quite close by 5 centimeters maybe. So it's quite a nice quite a nice take on it from both Pacheco, who a lot of his footwork seems to end there. Well, not to end there, to pass through this point. And Díaz de Viedma, he pointed it out with his octagon. And then Rada goes and say, okay, if I want to move 3 feet, I want to move 1 foot forward, and stepping like 3 feet away from the diameter, I end up here, which is part of the proportional mean circumference, and I'm going to call it the proportionate mean. But he's not in the proportional mean. He's not inventing it, he's just naming it. Which is interesting, but it's also, he's so into the modern mathematical proof thing that he describes very well why he's choosing it and how he's choosing it. So it's quite interesting to see that thing that we saw in Carranza's work, like, okay, I'm doing mathematics and I'm doing mathematics because this and this and this, and rather replicating it by, okay, I'm naming it
this way, this point, but it's because of this, and this, and it's quite interesting. And also, it's something that it's quite known about radars. I think the proportional mean. It's like, wow, he invented it. Well, not actually. He tries to end conclusion again. Sorry for the rata. He tries to conclude some work lines. He tries to end the parameterization of revolution surfaces. He uses a lot of cones, different cones for every joint of the arm. He does a pretty good job. He overkills it because he's described in the physical movement very well, but when he wants to explain us where the sword is, he needs to do a lot of specification, like I'm using my third cone in the sixth vertex of the pyramid that is going to be made to clockwise, and so on. So he is describing very well the space, but he's not doing it in the most efficient way, I think. For movement, yes, but for positioning, it's quite hard sometimes to take the. If you forget, for instance, of which cone he's talking about, oof, you are going to do some really weird things. And he uses two things that are, yes, the perfection of the parallel perspective that Ettenhard used by using the diagonal system, which is what we saw in the above picture, which have the parallel perspective of Ettenhard, but also the projecting into the floor of Pacheco, more precise, more. Yeah, it's a side view plus top view. Which is more precise. We could say it's better drawn, but it's the same idea. And he also used plane beams to divide the body, which means that he's, again, bounding something physical into something mathematical. He doesn't say, okay, I'm taking these lines because I like them. There are going to be two lines that go sideways, one which is in the middle of the body. He's more like, I'm going to take these ones because are useful, but there are a lot of them, and we could be all day naming lines in the body, in the human body, but we need references, and I'm using this beam of planes, which is perpendicular to the floor, which divides the human body, and these are the ones. Those lines represent. Sorry, Puck, what you were? I got the pop-ups from the chat, but I don't know if you were asking something or you were.
Yeah, so the lines that drop from the side view down onto the circle, it looks to me like those are aligning with the collaterals.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I think so. Well, yep. I think so. Because Rada tell us to point the collateral towards our opponent. So yeah, probably they are the two collaterals. Well, yeah. I don't know. now I am having doubts. Maybe are the collateral of the front of the body, the right collateral of the front of the body, and the left collateral of the back of the body. Because he's turning his body a little bit, so I don't think the second line, the first one, I think it's the front collateral, but I'm not sure. I will have to check it in little, actually. Okay, so a little bit summary. I hope you are not all sleepy now after me talking so much. We can say that Destreza joined mathematics and practical knowledge to explain and teach its own way to understand fencing. And by this I mean it's his own style, it has some characteristics, and they bound the mathematics we can do. It's not the same if we are trying to do fabrics and destreza. There are two techniques. We can analyze both of them with mathematics, but the results might not end up the same. It's like trying to shoot a cannon here in, to shoot a gun here in Earth or in Mars. Gravity is different, therefore, even they are bound by the same mathematics, the result is going to be different. Therefore, we have to take the differences into account to apply mathematics to every style of fencing. So the analysis Destreza does using mathematics, they might use universal tools like a circle, well, like conics. They don't need to be the same for all fencing styles. We could apply the same ideas to fabrics, Capoferro, I don't know, whatever, 133. And we might not end up with the same results because, well, the rules are the same, but the math that we do and the calculus we do might end up with different results. Okay, we are not going to say that the sword is floating in the air because of magic, but perfectly good, we will say, okay, but in this kind of style, because we are painting ourselves, we have to be more linear, because if we step aside, we will fail. And this has to show in the mathematics and in the result. If we don't acknowledge that, I think we are doing ourselves kind of a bad favor. We are, I don't know, there is an expression in Spanish that is hacerte un mal favor. In English, I don't know how to say, but basically you are tricking yourself into something that is not right. It's what I think, okay? People can think differently. Of course, they might be right and I might be wrong, but I don't think mathematics will give us the same results applied to other disciplines. I think this is important. You're doing yourself a favor. Thank you, Book. I think we have to take this in account because they say it a lot. Standing straight in the right angles, and then there is this line, there is this circle, there is, yeah, but standing straight from the right angle, because they need to start at some point and they need to start working about it. It's like the joke about cows being spheres in the vacuum. Yeah, okay, we have to start at some point and then we will take out all the idealizations, but we have to do it from something that is real, namely that the cows produce milk. Well, here I think we have to stay straight and use the right angle to parameterize, so to be the center of our axioms. So we have the different mathematical elements that we found in the stress are plane beams, real and compass structures, arithmetics, locus, curved and straight lines, revolution surfaces, sets, plane projections, and they are bound to different practical elements. The plane beams representing body divisions, rule and compass structures are for fencer movements and stances through space, meaning through the space in the floor, not the sword. Arithmetics are used for sword graduation and understanding the force we have to apply. Locus are for naming and understanding important positions because they are bound to distance and angles a lot of time, and it's the specialty of locus. Curve and straight lines are for sword guns and describe them and apply their properties to how to use them in fencing. Revolution surfaces are for parameterization of arm plus sword, namely where we put the sword and how we get there in an ideal way. I mean, we don't have to take, for instance, the radar cones. We cannot do them. In practical fencing, when we are fencing each other, if you try to do the reach cone, well, okay, you can do it, but you are not going with the enemy sword to anywhere because it's your weakest joint. It's impossible to do it exactly as the book says because he's idealizing it. You can do it very closely, enough closely, but it's an idealization.
a really good idealization, but we cannot we cannot be obsessed with no, I have to do it only for the wrist because the cone has two sides. It's the side of the sword and the side of the and you might use your arm to follow the other side of the cone and help you move the sword by that cone distance. Sets for technique classifications, and by sets I mean sets and the operations between them, which is quite interesting. But I don't think we are. I don't think I'm there yet to explain anything related to the sets and the technique classifications. And plain projectings to do graphical descriptions of the swords. For Verdadera Destreza, for orthodox Verdadera Destreza, this is all. And I like to step through some things very likely that there are more mathematics to do in fencing. Some really cool ideas that we have are Subcaelo work with the sword dynamics, sword stem that has some really cool ideas and articles. And why I mean by this is that we might think, okay, mathematics is done. Pacheco and his friends did everything that we could do. Now there are more things, and mathematics and science has evolved and has developed new tools that some of them I cannot even grasp how to apply because I'm not a physicist or an engineer, and I really appreciate the work and I really like it. But it's like, wow, I should study a lot to understand this. And I think it's cool, and I think it's really interesting. I think it proves that the way of putting mathematics into fencing is never end. It's not at an end. There are more mathematics to do with fencing in general. And of course, I think that there are more mathematics to do with Verdadera Destreza. And I think that there are some lines to follow, or at least for me, to follow in my study of Verdadera Destreza. And basically, is revealing the relations explained by the authors, the use, evolution, and equivalences between descriptions and ways to explain fencing. I'm referring to the mathematical part. Okay, it will serve in practice, of course, but I wouldn't say that we can follow the perfect evolution from Carranza's to Pacheco, for instance, because in Carranza we have very little technique. We can follow the mathematical way they thought, and we can study it because it's more rigid than the practice. If it's correlation or causality, well, okay, the common circle is really nice and very interesting, but maybe just be there because of, well, luck. If they are strong or weak relations, like Rada's definition of the proportional mean, which I know there is a paper about proportional mean and its generalization in other conics, meaning ellipses, parabolics, and so on. I haven't had the pleasure to read it. I don't know if I want to have that pleasure, but I think it could be very interesting for understanding if the proportional mean defined as Rada defined it is a weak relation between mathematics and reality, because that paper says, that I know, that paper says that it's just the proportional mean in the circumference doesn't generalize into other conics. So it might be lucky that Rada got that thing and say, okay, this is this definition. But if we want to go to the other thing that I think we should go with the mathematics related to Verdadera Destreza, that is try to generalize them for the lower plane to other weapons. As you can see, here is a tryout into sword and buckler. Well, it could be very long to explain. It seems to work, at least in Ávila, it's working for us. Probably outside won't work very well. I don't know. It's a tryout and it could be wrong, right? But I think it's worth trying.
and the formalization of sets and techniques, which is something I think it's quite hard because it's a lot to do with semantics and the way Pacheco and what Lois was saying before about Aristotelian philosophy. So this is maybe just some first idea. So
I have a question about the image.
Yeah.
Can you take us back? So you have an image that may be, is that 133?
The lower one, this?
Yes.
Yep.
Now, in there, the common circle is, it looks like it's a common oval. Can you talk me through that a little bit?
Yeah, of course. At some point, well, I get not obsessed, but a little obsessed with the idea of applying the maths behind the strength into other weapons. Mostly because I think, well, it's quite obvious that 153, that it's my main other branch of study in fencing. It's lacking distance and a lot of explanations about how to perform some techniques, which is something common to a lot of medieval treatises. And at some point, I get to apply what Alberto was saying, that well, the strength is universal, so we can apply it for everything. And I started to trying to apply the common circle, and I get very frustrated and infuriated because it didn't work. It was like hitting a wall. It's like, okay, I couldn't explain 133 using the common circle. Then this all was while I was in university studying mathematics. So I started to looking at a lot of my topics we studied there from a fencing point of view, which wasn't not very good to my studies, but was very good to my fencing. So I ended up trying to take the angles of the body and bounding them to a matrix, which either multiply by some vectors to obtain the equation of a conic. I did it trying to replicate a circle from the position of Verdadera Destreza, namely standing straight with the 90 degrees angle with the foot, with the arm, and so on. I take those measures and I started trying to put some. It was basically a 3x3 matrix with sin of some angles, cosine of some angles. I'm sin and cosine. I don't know if I'm telling them speaking about them right. Trigonometry. I don't know if I'm telling right sin and cosine because I haven't had the pleasure of speaking about mathematics a lot in English. So, okay, so I applied some trigonometric functions in the matrix, and I then try to express it as an equation. Sine and cosine. Okay, thank you. Sorry for the puzzling detail. So when I take, I took it and I draw the equation using a Wolfram Alpha tool and Wolfram Mathematics, which is basically a software for mathematics. And Wolfram Alpha is quite useful and it's free. So if you want to use it, it's quite good for high school kids to check their equations and their solutions because it's really nice. So I use it to draw it, and it worked out. It worked out. It ended up being that oval there, and I started to try to apply the ideas of Rada into 133, but the main focus was this has to explain the footwork, but it cannot change the actions of 153. I mean, if the treaty said to me that I have to go down under the sword and buckler, for instance, in the first play, you go under the sword and buckler, then you can do three things: ligatio, mutatio gladi, or taking your opponent's weapons. I don't recall it very well now, but I had to. Yeah, yes. Yeah, legatio is binding the sword. Yeah. I should be able to do that and explain it without changing it. I mean, the treaty is right. The treaty is right. I am, and my calculus are the ones that are wrong if they don't fit. And I started working with it, and well, it kind of explains some things. It allows us to, for instance, taking the proportional mean into the oval. It's very helpful and has been very helpful to me to understand the custodias ideas. So if you place the custodias as the custodias are some of the cards of the 133 are custodias, and they are used to break the opponent defense through the cards. There are 7 basic guards, and there are some custodia that they are said to be used to break the first custodias, and then you work from on there. Doing the custodias work around the proportional mean is very helpful, not going all the way through the common circle, but through the common oval. It's very helpful because being not so open, the path being not so open, it allows you to work really well from a square position you need in sword and buckler. It allows you to bind and to do quite a lot of our interpretation of 133, which is basic, it's our interpretation, so I wouldn't say it's the 133, it's work. And basically, it's a tryout to generalize the idea of the common circle to sword and buckler. Going to the image, which is, I might think it's what you were asking me. If we take the ovals, they will be the common circle, as understand as the way we walk around our enemy. We walk through there to get to the proportional mean, and then we could move into the space defined by the oval, or we will continue walking the oval to get a wound. Similarly, as we'll do Rada, well, we can go to the mean to the proportional mean there, and then we could walk through any of the ovals to get wounds from the outside, let's say, or we could go from the lines that are just taken out of Rada because I needed some straight lines to figure out where to go. And we could go into thrusting or leaving the bind and retaking it from a higher position. So the oval would be the common circle, and these parabolics out here will be another feature that I am not sure if it fixes really well a problem that I found with Verdadera Destreza, and is that I think that there are more circles, more abstract circles that are depicted because they fall one into another, so we only see one. So there will be a common circle to walk around, and a circle or a conic or a common circle to check for the conclusion, which have to be into the perpendicular to the diameter. But, and this was one of the main things about this line of work that I am trying out, and I will rest into saying this is a work in progress. It might be completely wrong, or no, I don't know. If you try to take the weapons of the opponent in sword and buckler, it's quite hard, and it's not happening here. It's not happening in that line. So what I obtained from Wolfram software was check it paraboloid of revolution, or revolution paraboloid. It's like
Yep, parabola.
yeah. It was three. Well, it's like taking a. The 3D figure was like taking a paper and squeezing it in the middle and well, squeezing it here, and then it develops. It's like making rotate these lines through the middle axis. So one cut was the oval, another cut was another oval, and the other cut was this line, the parabola. So I start wondering what was there, and these dotted lines here. This one is the one what is that's on. Seems to be a nice fit to do there the raping the sword and buckler of the opponent thing in 153. I think it seems because it's really hard. I don't know if I'm doing it right in practice, so I'm probably wrong about it. I don't know if I'm wrong about the line or I'm wrong in my practice, but it's something I have to take account of it. So it's like showing a really fuzzy and puzzling work in progress, but I think it's worth mentioning because I think it's important to think about it, because in Destreza we have the authors telling a lot that thing that this is universal, this works for all the weapons, it's perfect, it's marvelous. Well, yes, but no. Okay, it's really nice. I really like Destreza, but I think I don't know if some of you work in engineering fields or related to mathematical field, but it's like in high school. For those who don't, you think the solution is one thing, and then there is other thing that is completely off your first guess. So I really think that that was important, and I think it's a way to look into what we could do with mathematics today related to Verdadera Destreza, other than analyzing what they did that time. I don't know if I had answered your question, because...
Yeah, I think so. And we are after 8 o'clock, so
Sorry.
I don't want to delay the presentation anymore.
Okay, I'll stop sharing with you the presentation if you will think.
Yeah, so this is typically when we would ask questions, and I do have some questions. So by the time we get to Rada's book, Newton's Principia, which describes the laws of motion, have been published, and you mentioned that Rada is bringing in Descartes into his work. So he's bringing in new math. Do you have any evidence that he's bringing in anything from Newton and the laws of motion?
No, and it's something that I think Destreza is lacking. It's like, sorry, lacking, not lacking. I think it's lacking from Destreza that they are not up to the mathematics of their time. Mathematics is way beyond what Destreza authors use. They use mainly Greek math and geometry, and they don't take the differentiation integration work of Newton, Leibniz, and so on into account. I don't know if it will help. I don't know if Principia Mathematica of Newton is taken in account. I don't. Probably some of it is in Rada's life, because he was a military man, and they were doing calculus for the guns and so on. But I'm not sure at all if he even read Newton's work. I would like to think they do, and they didn't use it because they didn't think that it was needed for their work. But it's something that they weren't doing their homework right.
That's good. I do have another question.
Yes, sir.
Last week, we were in a discussion and we were talking about whether it was appropriate to include modern mathematics and science in the tradition today. And I was just wondering what your thoughts about that are, because it looks to me like you're trying to apply the Destreza mathematics that already exists, and maybe there's a place for things like Newtonian physics.
Yes, yeah, I think that every step we take, adding mathematics, the work I have just explained about the 153 diagram, it's just that they didn't know about matrices, they didn't know about projecting certain things. They know about a lot of things. Of course, we are doing geometry in 3D, which is it's something Greeks already did, so no big thing there. But I really think that applying it can do harm. It can only do either or understanding their point of view or getting it better, or even saying, okay, they were doing this wrong. I mean, it's not bad to say, okay, Pacheco was wrong about the momentum and the place where we have to move the sword to be perfectly efficient, because we can work it out now from maths and Newtonian physics and modern physics. It's not bad. It's just probably it's going just to be a little bit off of what they say and what they have learned from practice. But I think it's perfectly good. Okay, we cannot say, okay, this is new Destreza. We are changing everything. They were all wrong, because it's the foundations of the system, and well, they were the ones who wore swords and fight with them. But I think it's no harm to apply modern scientific ideas to it. Always being careful, of course, of not making mistake and not stating that we are right because we are modern and we have better tools than them to study.
Thanks for that input. We just had a really lively discussion, and you really did cover a lot of those questions. I want to open up everyone else for questions. So maybe type your questions in the chat, and Eric and I will ask.
Seems like no one is.
So it is traditional. It's become traditional to ask about what you. Can you talk to us about your take on acometimiento?
About my take on acometimiento. What's the current state of the opinion about? I mean, well, acometimiento at first sight is just a really well done feint. But I mean, it's not a feint because there are no feints in the Destreza. But actually, it's like I'm going to stab you, and if you do nothing, I'm going to stab you. But I'm ready to change my mind about that. I think Rada explains it like you throw in a. Well, Rada almost talks all the time about acometimiento perfecto, so it's thrust into the face and thrust like you are going to thrust him. So if he does nothing, you are just doing a first dignity treta. So if he changes something, meaning he binds, first of all he's assuming he's going to bind to avoid it. If he does anything different, like bending himself and stabbing you in the belly, Rada doesn't explain about how to deal with it, because Rada is explaining about a symmetric position, so he's thinking about a diestro defending from a acometimiento, so he's going to bind and then do something. you should be ready then to work from that line. So I try to do them more often than not. I mean, it's a good way to start talking with your opponent. I'm going to start you. Are you right with that?
Thanks. Do we have other questions?
I'm just by the completeness. Yeah, it's a quite broad topic to talk about, and every time I talk about it, I'm worried about people getting not stunned by bored by the whole thing, because it's quite there are lots of not lots of treatises that are depicted, but they are quite advanced. And it's a wide topic, so. I'm always worried when I talk about mathematics that people is going to be like, okay, I don't really like these maths. I'm not going to ask. I'm not going to. Oh, I'm glad you like it.
I think it's really interesting to see what you talked about, like what they were using the mathematics to describe. It's pretty, I don't know, I want to say like kind of complicated, but also they don't go into they go into too much detail or not enough when they use it. So it's really nice to see you categorize how it's applied.
For studying the mathematics before Descartes, I would mostly recommend history books about mathematics, because reading previous to Descartes mathematics, and I would even say previous to Leibniz mathematics and Newton, which are using other notation and other words not other words, but other notation and other kind of mindset, it's quite hard and puzzling. I mean, if you are really into mathematics, you could try to check the elements of Euclides, but it's really a painful lecture. I tried a lot of time back. It wasn't a pleasure. Probably there is a book that I think it's translated to English too, and it should be. And I'm going to try to find. It's a Russian book, but it has a first introduction into mathematics history, which is really nice. I've read about it mostly in Spanish publications from different kinds. Publication that the newspaper did, like this type of collection thing of books talking about a lot of mathematics topics, and they were covering really well the mathematics history. But I could recommend you I'm checking it in Google, so I can tell you the name of the book. Okay. I think I'm good. Oops. It's that book has a really good introduction into mathematics history and takes a good look about what was previous to Descartes.
So I do have another question. Looking at the mathematics in Aristotle, we get from his virtues, the medio concept between two extremes lies of virtue. But then when we get into proportion and proportionate, sometimes he attempts to do like raw calculations. Have you worked through any of that?
Through Radas or through, sorry?
Aristotle.
Aristotle, no. Well, I have worked calculations about Pacheco's and Radas, but mainly about the footwork and the distance they cover. I don't know if that's what you are asking for.
No, but if you haven't looked into the proportionate in Aristotle, it'll be it won't make any sense what I'm asking.
No. I haven't studied the philosophy behind Aristotle.
Okay. Any other questions?
I know it's there, and I have a couple of friends that are very into it, but maths take most of my time.
Right. All right. Well, thank you so much for speaking with us. And I know you stayed up very late in the night to do this, so I appreciate that as well. Great job presenting in a foreign language. It's always really challenging, and your English was just excellent.
I'm
So,
I made some mistakes, but thank you for the compliment.
we were able to understand you pretty well. I think the audio was a little low, but other than that, it's all right. We
I've also dropped the mic.
All right. So next week we will have Ash Mestizo, and he's going to be talking about applying Destreza to unarmed combat. So he's doing some of the same kind of analysis work where he is taking Destreza concepts, the circles and the geometry, and applying that to unarmed fighting. Should be really interesting. All right. Thank you, everybody. And I will see you next week.